Because one of the interesting things was this article that came about from the CEO of Spotify. I've forgotten his name. He's got a strange to me anyway, Swedish name of some kind. And he said something that was pretty, I mean, it's quite a known fact among artists, but my feeling is that it's quite a controversial statement to be making as the CEO of like the number one music platform in the world, right? Which is that artists, he said specifically, artists can't expect to release an album every 3 or 4 years. What was it that he said exactly? He said, you can't record music every 3 to 4 years and think that's going to be enough. And here's the article here. One of the things that was, if you think traditionally, artists would follow that kind of time scale, right? Every 3 to 4 years seemed like a reasonable time scale for a musician to release a new album. Maybe 4 years is pushing it, but I would say every 2 to 3 years. And two was like a very regular schedule for a musician, for an artist, particularly if they were doing some touring, right? Because what would happen in that instance would be the artist would release something, they'd go on tour, they'd go on and do lots of press and whatnot, and then after that they'd get back into the studio, or they'd go to a cabin and they'd pour their hearts out in a cabin and like get some songs down, demo them, go into pre-production, various phases of developing ideas to ensure that what's coming out is a quality product and has some is art, essentially. Like, music should be art. And one of the things that this CEO of Spotify is, well, I keep forgetting his name, more like Eek, but one of the things that Eck is saying is that we should be releasing more often. And he says, I feel really that the ones that aren't doing well in streaming are predominantly people who want to release music the way it used to be released. Now, that's kind of what I'm talking about in terms of the timeline. Now, music has been released in that way for decades, right? And it's changing. Within 3-4 years, it's seriously changing. It's becoming a lot more... I mean, we thought before with the big record companies that music had been commoditized. But, Jesus, now it's commoditized to an entirely different scale, to the point where, you know, as an artist myself who releases music reasonably infrequently, getting traction with that music is very difficult on streaming platforms. And as part of some of the networks that I'm involved with and included on, there's a lot of discussion about how often we should be releasing music, how quickly we should be writing music. Obviously, one of the key elements here is that being able to produce and record music at home is a very interesting shift in the dynamic, right? So it basically cuts out a lot of middlemen potentially. But those middlemen, and we're talking about professional producers, professional mixers, they're an important step in... like, you should see them as a filter, right? They're essentially a filter that gives a different view on the music that's being recorded. And when it comes to art, it can be very subjective, but getting that art moved through a different lens can be very important to ensure that it connects with your listeners. And that is something that is not happening anymore. It was also the case that albums used to be something that say you had 10 tracks that you had to put on an album, 10, 12 tracks, it would be extremely common for an artist to write more than they needed. So they would write 15, 20 tracks potentially for an album. And that would take them maybe a year or two of solid writing, right? And, or not, it could just, there are certain albums that artists can go into the studio for 3-4 months, but that is an even more expensive and rare proposition these days. But either way, you would be producing more music than you needed and then you would present on an album. And the way that you would potentially release some of those extra songs would be as B-sides on singles. So that's not really a thing anymore. So what tends to be happening now, and what tends to be the preferred way of releasing music, is really more releasing singles one at a time, potentially up to 5 or 6 singles, or even more. Sometimes the entirety of the album is released in singles before the album is released, right? And then essentially you've got artists basically putting everything out without a filter, without traditionally those people in those trusted positions, producers and engineers and mixers, who would be able to not only craft the sound but also say, do you know what, the album, the way we're crafting it, it could work better like this, it could work better like that, we could view it through a different lens, we can reorchestrate this differently, we could change this to really make the song come to life. That's potentially gone, right? And the people who are often, or at least the model that Eck here in his interview, the model that stands the chance of succeeding the most is art as commerce. So basically he wants people producing like 2 albums worth of material a year, like around a song a week, a song every, well, not a song every week, but a song every 2 weeks potentially, right? Because you think an album has 10, 12 tracks, you got 10, 12 months in the year. And so the people that are succeeding the most and building an audience on Spotify are the ones that are churning out music, promoting that music constantly. They have a continuous conversation on social media that is about those songs and is driving those songs. And we end up in a position where you're getting these people who are doing well and they're going to burn out. They're going to burn out. It's not sustainable. And can you really call it art at that point? Like, for me, as a lyricist, I want to say stuff and I want to talk about stuff that's really important to me. I'm sorry, I don't have 25 songs of important stuff to say in me every year. That is not some manner of repeating myself. It's essentially pop music. He has created a platform that is geared towards commercial pop music and rewards commercial pop music. Yes, it's possible to be popular on Spotify in a niche, but in my opinion, artists are being failed by the Spotify algorithm and by, evidently, the ethos and the beliefs of the CEO. It is plain wrong, in my opinion, just completely wrong for art and music to be approached in this way. You could argue that people are consuming music differently now, right? You could argue that they're consuming more music. They have less affiliation with individual artists. In other words, they care less than they used to about who has made a song that they like. And and you could argue that that came before Spotify, but I think it's a bit of a chicken and egg situation. In my opinion, yes, there may have been changes in the way that people were consuming music, but Spotify has really gone about cementing and furthering the negative aspects of that type of music ingestion. I mean, I'm a Spotify user myself, so I have a lot of good things to say about them, and I use Spotify to discover new music. But when I discover a new artist, I save their album that the song was from. I look up more information about that artist, and I really become invested in that artist. And I think that's something that's happening less and less these days. People are more likely to be listening to a song through a playlist, for example, and because of that, we're essentially severing the connection between listener and artist. The listener has no investment in the artist themselves. They see a song they like, they hear a song they like, they save that song. But the chances of them going and finding out more information about that particular artist, maybe saving the album that was from, if there is indeed an album, less and less that seems to be the case these days. It seems to be that almost every album name is the same as the song name. I mean, even Spotify's platform, the fact that when I load up Spotify here, for example, and you see the way that Spotify is here, if I go to my say, for example, my discover my release radar, for example, the number of songs, I don't think you can see this, but the number of songs, I'll cover my entire face. The number of songs whose... Why am I doing this? This is wrong. I should not be doing this. The number of songs here whose album title is the same as the song title is, well, they're most of them. Violent Sun, Fallen Torches, By Any Means, Restless Boy, Gross Mile Accept. Even Spotify's dated interface no longer reflects the way in which music is released. This is like, these are not albums, so why are they listed as an album? It's actually quite worrying that it seems that Spotify have created or contributed very heavily to a way in which people consume music that even their platform has not been designed to support. And that's the scary thing here. They've unleashed a beast. And can that beast be put in the cage? Can we get listeners to reconnect with artists? Or is it just a matter of that connection is now, for the most part, severed, and we're in a situation where we don't know where we're going? And I mean, I worry for the state of music releases, the commerce or the commercialization of art, to the point where people, in order to rise above the visible threshold to get onto Spotify playlists, are having to release with a frequency where the quality is no doubt impaired. I mean, it's said, the guy, there's a Twitter here from Matt Dryhurst. I'm not sure who Matt Dryhurst is, but he said, love someone to do a proper investigative piece on what X suggestion of continuous engagement / rapid album cycles means for musicians. Unpaid spec work labour camps full of young producers competing for an Insta cross post are rife. For example, hidden costs to this frequency. And by hidden costs, he's talking about not just the way in which people are listening to the music, he's talking about the costs on those artists themselves. That he's saying it's literally like labor camps full of young producers. This is a serious, growing mental health catastrophe waiting to happen for people who really want to express themselves and get their art out there, but who are forced to do it at a schedule that is frankly inhuman for either any period of time, or simply inhuman in terms of how long they can do it for, right? Or in terms of quality even. He says, another easy way to dismiss the accessibility argument: who has the means to generate 2 albums a year? Either those willing to put out subpar work, ding, or those with big enough names to corral others to do the work for them. And that's another point, another very serious point that he makes, is that yes, it's going to be a lot of people who are talking about artists with massive networks who are doing a lot of features, a lot of people involved in the writing process. Some songs nowadays have got 7-8 writers in the credits, right? It's insane. But when you have that volume of people, and essentially they're bouncing the songs between them, and the artist has an almost peripheral impact on the output, it becomes possible to release at that frequency. But do we as listeners really want to hear songs that have been constructed in almost by an algorithm, in a paint by numbers way, in order to get it out on time? For me, the answer is a massive no, and I'll tell you why it's a massive no. Because music for me is about connection. It's about listening to someone who has shared an emotional state with you, something that you can connect to, right? That for me is a massive part of being able to call yourself an artist. Being an artist is connecting with people. And that is something that becomes much trickier to do if you're forced to write music week in, week out, without break, in order to compete with an algorithm, a soulless algorithm that will inevitably burn you out. And what have you produced? I would rather produce one amazing masterpiece than 10 mediocre songs. Every song that I approach, I put my heart and soul into. And that's not something that I can do 20, 25 times a year. That for me is hell. That is not the role of an artist. That is the role of a slave to the algorithm. And, I can't work that way. I refuse to work that way. It's not in my body, it's not in my soul to be able to produce at that frequency, because I want the art to matter, right? So I think, regardless of what the algorithm is saying, I'm going to struggle very heavily to meet X desire or X plans for where music is going. I hope there is outrage over his comments. From what I've seen, there is some degree of outrage. There is some degree of upset about this. He said, someone replied to this. Zola Jesus of Tsushima says, Daniel X's vision of the future includes turning musicians into factory bots, churning out frozen hamburger music for no one but the algorithm. Exactly what I've said. And I saw a very interesting post today by and very interesting discussion by initiated by Sarah Longfield, who's a guitarist and now does a lot of electronic music, who's if I can find her post, hopefully she hasn't removed it because it would be a shame. Or maybe I don't have the right Sarah Longfield. Here we go. So she says, let me see, is this a public post? Yes, this is a public post. Lovely. And Zoom. No, I don't want to log in. She says about the article, and that's on capitalism driving home the belief that if you're not constantly producing something, you hold little to no value, and that the value you do hold is intrinsically and eternally tied to labor, not product. Spotify and its algorithm is turning the artists into a product, right? And it's all about slave labor. And they're making money off it. They're not breaking even. So surely there's something not right about what they're doing, because they're barely breaking even. There's a lot of interesting comments here. Exploitation of labor is the bedrock of the American economy. Oh, we're going into deep territory here. If you can't find someone else's labor to exploit, you don't deserve to be successful. Don't complain when the guitar robots come for your job, lazy fingers. Maybe you should have worked harder inventing something. He's obviously being very tongue-in-cheek. Like a font for sarcasm I could have been paying to use all this time. A lot of people are very upset with this. Try new Spotify Premium forced artistic labor camps. We have you producing generic money-making fad hits that will be forgotten tomorrow, today. Someone here that says buying physical media is the better way to support artists. CDs and especially vinyl are things I'm proud to collect. And more I'm feeling that that might be the case, even though I haven't listened to physical media for a very long time. Man, if that's the way to best support artists, if that's the way to connect to the artist and connect to the artists who are actually producing meaningful stuff, then that might be very well the way forward, right? Colin here is saying the fact that you have to justify yourself multiple times is pretty depressing. So there's obviously a lot of people here that are complaining, oh, why are you complaining about Spotify, blah, blah, blah. But yeah, I mean, that's what I have to say about Spotify. I think overall they are doing a disservice to artists, not just because traditionally that discussion has been around pay and not paying them what they deserve, but beyond that, it's how they are shaping the listener-artist relationship and the music listener relationship. And in my opinion, they are commoditizing it to the extent whereby that relationship is being eroded and is becoming more about volume than it is about connection. And music, my friends, is about connection. It's about resonating with people. That's all I have to say on that. I can't say any more. I think the rant is over. Frankly, I still remain a fan of Spotify because I find that I'm able to use it in a way that allows me to discover new music. But I would be wrong to suggest that it is without a huge number of flaws for the vast majority of listeners and vast majority of subscribers. And yeah, I think ultimately we need to find a different way. I don't know what that way forward is. I'd love to hear from you, to hear what you have to say about that, whether you think there are different ways that we can listen to music to connect with the artists, because that is key. We need to bring the connection back to music. We need to bring the authenticity back to music. And producing songs week in, week out does not equal authenticity. It equals manufacturing. That's all I have to say about it. Sad state of affairs, in my opinion.